That's funny. All right. Well, welcome everybody. And as people pour in, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you and good afternoon for attending today's presentation over GIS data preparation for NG9-1-1. My name is Dustin Becker, and I'm the Business Development Manager for Datamark, and I support the Gulf Coast region. On the call with me, I have Annie Cahill, who's our GIS Technical Consultant, and Becca Mangan, who's our GIS Technical Manager. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to put it in the chat, and we'll have those answered during the presentation. Today's goals, if we take a look, are going to be how to access the current state of your GIS data, the state and NENA Standards alignment, your best practices for GIS data management, and the path forward, combining the future and the present. And with that being said, I'm going to pass the mic over to Annie, and she's going to take it over.
Thank you, Dustin. So good afternoon / good morning, everyone. Thank you for spending another hour with us. This is my second webinar of the year, so I'm glad that there's such a good turnout, even though this is the second webinar of the year with me. But hang in there because we have more exciting content coming the rest of the year and some exciting news about our virtual conference coming up at the end of this webinar. So we want to talk to you today about getting your data ready for NG9-1-1 and kind of what that process looks like, okay? And first we have to start the discussion about standards and how to assess your data, okay? So there is the national standard, which is put out by NENA, which is the National Emergency Number Association, okay? And that is the national standard that defines the data model that all GIS data has to adhere to for NG9-1-1, okay? Now, a lot of states or localities have their own standard. Usually at the state level, you're going to see some standards that not only meet the national standard, but also exceed. And I know that that's kind of a different concept, but we do work with a lot of clients who have to adhere to their state standard, which, like I said, often meets the national standard, but it does exceed in different ways. So you may have a state standard that requires additional layers. Like I know our friends in Oklahoma, they have to have ESDs in addition to their emergency service boundaries and the other emergency call routing boundaries, okay? You may also need to have different fields as part of your data model. So information like storm shelter location or other location fields or additional sub-addressing fields, transportation fields, or even fields that might be specific to local validations or processes. There are a lot of different reasons why a state may choose to implement their own localized standard, okay? But oftentimes this does relate back to kind of like a local aggregation of state data, okay? And sometimes that data is run through an additional process at the state level. And so you may have fields that are pertinent to those local processes or validations. So I wanted to kind of ask a question of the group, because you know I'm big on discussion. So if you would share with us your location, ASL, if you would share your location in the chat and kind of let us know what you're doing at your state to get your data ready for NG9-1-1. Do you have a state standard that you're following? Are you following the national standard? And if so, what are you guys actually doing? Or maybe you haven't started those conversations yet, and that's perfectly fine. I just want to kind of get to know where you guys are at, because I see a lot of new names in the webinar today that I haven't seen before. So I just want to kind of understand what you're doing. Florida, California, North Carolina, Alabama. Hi, Rhonda. Okay, so we have someone from Tupelo, Mississippi. And Doug, what state are you in? Okay.
Looks like we have people from all over, Annie.
We do. We do. I love it.
Even
Thank you guys
Canada.
so
We
much.
got some Canada folks on the call.
I love it.
Oh, international.
There we go.
Hey, look, we have Calvert County. Calvert's one of our clients. Baltimore. Hi, Bill.
Excellent.
Texas represent.
Right.
Me and Dustin are in Texas.
Yay. All right. I love this.
Good
Okay.
deal.
So thank you guys for sharing that. It is always a good idea to have an understanding of what you're working with, because ultimately NG9-1-1 readiness, that's the end, right? Like that's the goal. But you kind of have to work backwards from that and say, okay, well, what are my parameters? What are my requirements? What am I working toward? So kind of the first thing is doing an assessment of your data. And there's kind of different facets to this, but there are those things that you can identify with the naked eye. Okay, so when you have an understanding of your either local or the national standard, you're going to have an understanding of what layers are actually required in those models. Okay, whether it be at the national level or at the local level, those layers should be defined in that model. And I know for a fact that they are in the national model. Okay, so these are the minimum required layers. So road center lines, address points, your PSAT boundary, provisioning boundary, and then you have your service boundaries for fire, police, and EMS. Okay, these are the minimum service boundaries. If you're in a coastal area and you have Coast Guard response, that could be another service boundary for you. Also poison control or park police. There are lots of possibilities for service boundaries. Okay, so these are the minimums. And like I said, at the state level, you're going to need to have an understanding of what additional layers, if any, are required, okay? Because you may not have those, you may develop those, or take a second look at them because they might not be something that you maintain on a regular basis, okay? So that's pretty simple, right? We can all look through, you know, our geodatabases or our shapefiles or however we're maintaining our data and determine what layers we already have. So there are different facets to completeness. We just talked about the required layers, and now we need to take a deeper dive. So within our layers, we have our attribute tables. Okay, so we have different fields in our attribute tables, and I'm sorry if I'm speaking very simply for the GIS people who are here. We have to remember that this is kind of like a mixed audience, so I don't want to use these complex terms or terms that people are not familiar with. So I'm trying to just be kind of like on a level here that I can speak to everyone. So we want to make sure that all of the fields that are required within our data models are maintained. Okay, we don't want to leave any of our mandatory fields blank. We're making sure that if we already maintain data, that we use that going forward in those conditional fields within the data model. And then also making sure, do we have all of the GIS data that we need to have? Are we missing streets? Are we missing addresses? And how would we know, right? So those are all different kind of facets of completeness. And then we go into accuracy and data quality, okay? Which those are things that we can kind of look at and understand. Some things are more obvious. We have gaps and slivers that we can identify through a topological process, or, you know, even when you're looking through your GIS data and you see that you have a road center line that's been digitized twice. Some things are kind of obvious to see, but some things are not, okay? But in terms of accuracy, we're talking about how we're maintaining the data and the quality of that data, and then also the location of the features. How are we maintaining our address points? How are we maintaining our road center lines? And how are those being digitized in and represented in our GIS? So I'm kind of laughing here because what I'm envisioning is all of the seasoned GIS people. I want you to drop a note in the chat and be honest, because I'll know if you're lying. Raise your hand or type a yes if you're sensitive about your data. Are you sensitive? Do you feel close to your data? Is it kind of an extension of you? What are we seeing in the chat? Yes, OCD.
Excellent.
Yes. Are you
She's asking for the fellow GIS nerds to step forward.
Okay.
Everybody,
Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
very much, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Wow.
so for me, I was 15 years in GIS, okay, before I came to Datamark, 15 years in local government GIS. You should be sensitive about your data because it's an extension of you, right? Like we spend all of this time, especially if you've been in your position for a long time, you know, you spend all this time kind of nurturing the data. You know, maybe you inherited it from someone who didn't use really good editing practices. You know, we all get our data from somewhere, right? So we've worked hard on this. We've really done everything we can to make sure that it's where it needs to be. We've gone through the process of identifying the layers that we need. We've added fields to our data to make sure that it meets the model. And now we need to understand the quality of that data, okay? And I've worked with many GIS people who are very sensitive about their data. But one of the things that is a really good practice is to do what's called a data readiness check. That's our name for it. That's an assessment of your GIS data, okay? And you can think of this as kind of shining a flashlight in dark places of the data that we don't always think to check. As local government GIS people, I'm fully aware of the challenges that you face and the many hats that you wear every single day. Okay, and how easy is it when you're digitizing in a new subdivision or a new road, or you go in and you make a split and you're in your road center line and your phone rings and you have to go and do something, and the next thing you know, oh my gosh, I forgot to adjust a range, and you don't even think about it, right? This stuff happens all the time. Even with, you know, the OG GIS people, you know, things happen, right? And especially if there's no prompt, if there's no immediate QC process, it's very easy to introduce error unintentionally or unexpectedly, or even inherit error from previous data maintenance people, right? We've never had that problem. We've never had other people mess around in our data, have we? That's never been an issue. So one of the things that I would encourage all of you to do is to have your data assessed. Now, this is something that, this is just a screenshot of our data readiness check. This is something that we do as DataMark, but also other vendors do as well. I don't know what they call it, but it's a good idea to illuminate those things in your data that you may not be thinking about, like parity inconsistency, address range overlaps. Digitized direction is not always obvious unless you're identifying those endpoints of your road center lines. So just different things like that can be very illuminating for your data quality, and it can help you identify where you have most of your anomalies and where you need to kind of start that cleanup effort. And Becca, did you have anything you wanted to add in here about the DRC?
No, just reiterating what you said, that it's a great first step to really get the big picture of where your data stands today. And remembering that for NG9-1-1, there are different specifications than maybe you're maintaining currently in your workflows. So it's good to have that snapshot view.
I love these comments. I love the chats, guys. Keep them coming. This is great. Yeah, so the important thing is to keep an open mind when you have your data assessed. You know, you guys, I can already tell you, without even meeting a lot of you, that you're doing a good job. Okay, a lot of you have limited resources. You're wearing multiple hats, like we already mentioned, and you've been doing a good job with your GIS data. You know, we have to remember that GIS as a practice kind of emerged from planning and zoning. It was a land use tool. Okay, so we're now asking our data to do something that it's never had to do before with a level of accuracy and completeness that it's never had to have before, okay? And so, you know, don't be alarmed when you see higher numbers of anomalies coming through on certain things, because we've never had to ask you before to be a geospatial first responder. And that's really what NG9-1-1 is asking of you as GIS professionals, okay? So don't take it to heart, just look at it as, you know, an opportunity to improve. And know that you can develop a path and that there is help available out there for you. Okay, so now we're going to discuss data maintenance and quality, right? So after we assess our data, we get the results back, we have an understanding of what we need to do. We are going to talk about, first thing is first, the attributes. Now, there was a NENA document from 2009 that talks about this 98%. You have to have, you know, 98% synchronization rate. So, but what you're not understanding and what they're not telling you, or what we're not really talking about, is the fact that that was between the MSAG and ALLY databases, which are tabular, and the tabular part of GIS. Remember that for the non-GIS folks, GIS is Geographic Information System. It's this kind of marriage of geography and information together, okay? And you can separate the two, but the real value is when they're together. So just like with NG9-1-1, you want to make sure that you're not only considering the attributes, but also the geography as well, and the geometry of those features. So there's a lot of different facets that are introduced when we start talking about the geometry. So yes, the attributes are extremely important. They do facilitate that call routing and information exchange when the call comes into the PSAP. That actually is achieved by a point and polygon query, which is why it's so important that you have those service boundaries. So your PSAP boundary and then your individual service boundaries for fire, police, and EMS, okay? And like we kind of mentioned before, you know, you've been maintaining your data for different business needs, okay? How many of us, go ahead and drop in the chat, besides public safety, what other systems in your enterprise are you using your GIS data for? What else are you provisioning GIS data to? Asset management, permitting. I know you guys probably have a lot of different systems, right? Yep. Public works, zoning. Yeah. Yeah, pretty much everything, right? So get familiar with the data model. Get familiar with the NENA data model. Have an understanding of what it is and what's required of your GIS data. Because a lot of you are going to have a bigger conversation on your hands, especially for the very mature GIS departments who have kind of been established for a long time. The data is being used in a lot of your different systems currently. You're going to have a bigger conversation. And oftentimes, for the more mature GIS departments, it's a harder conversation than somebody who doesn't even have GIS, right? Because it's how do I fit my data now to meet new demands of a new system? Because NG9-1 will not work without your GIS data. So it's kind of like you have to start having these conversations today. Do I maintain an entirely different data set? Do I develop an ETL process? Do I, you know, just kind of Frankenstein all my schemas together and have this gargantuan sort of thing that everyone can edit? So these are bigger conversations that you need to start having today.
All right, so let's talk about attribute maintenance for NG9-1-1. I'll first say that the requirements are incredibly specific, and there's a reason for that. We are creating consistencies across data sets nationwide. So the first step would be to know the mandatory fields for NENA and your state standards. I'll also say that if by looking at this image here gives you a little bit of anxiety, I don't think you're alone. We are in a phase of education about these requirements and a transition. So I know Annie just said it, but you'll notice throughout this whole webinar that the common theme here is we need to realize that we're asking our GIS data to do something that it's never had to do before. So I would say the first step really would be to get familiar with the requirements and what is being asked of your data. So this image here represents a portion of the centerline data table in that GIS data model document that Annie had on the previous slide. And that column that has the MCO represents whether the field is mandatory, optional, or conditional. So at the very minimum, all mandatory fields should be maintained to meet NENA standards. It really just depends on your data and what systems your data support to understand the conditional and optional fields that you need to maintain. But the data model document gives specific details about what values are acceptable in each of those fields listed. So for example, the 8 NENA fields that make up a street information of the road or an address point requires every value to be fully spelled out. And I have an example on the next slide to show the difference between how some data is maintained currently and how it would look formatted to meet standards. So I wanted to say that understanding that the goal of NextGen is to create that common language of information across data sets that support the data exchange between PSAPs and other entities. Understanding that can really help make sense of why the requirements are so specific. So looking at this example here, we see this top image has 2 fields to host all the street information, right? All the street attributes. There are some inconsistencies with the abbreviations. There are directional values in the same field. There's an address number suffix in that add number field. And this very well may be how y'all are maintaining your information right now. But just know that with NG9-1-1, that's not going to fly, you know, unfortunately. So again, there is a big picture reason for these specifics. So this bottom image here has the same values formatted to meet the standards. And you'll see the address number suffix field has been separated into its own field. This satisfies that standard that an address number is a whole number within an integer type field. You also see the values of the street post types. They're parsed out, and directionals. They're fully spelled out, mixed case formatting. So remember that some of these fields are conditional within the standards, but conditional essentially means that if it's within your data, it needs to be maintained, okay? So again, each field contains designated specific information, and that allows for a more detailed ability to standardize data. So when we think about data integrity, by having those individually parsed fields of your attributes, you know, it just creates better quality assurance. And it's a lot easier to maintain data that has those set values for each field than to have to kind of sift through a concatenated field to find those discrepancies. So I have another example on the next slide. So this is an example of proper attribute maintenance of road centerline ranges. So before I explain the screenshot, I want to say that NG9-1-1 requires a holistic approach to data management. It's no longer the address points and the roads, right? So we have to understand the relationships required between the 2 data sets. So in this example, just to give some context, those red lines represent anomalies flagged using our VEP software. So they're currently flagged on the fishbone lines, which fishbones show that relationship between the address point and center lines. So it's going to point to where that address is geocoded along the associated road range. And in this specific example, we see that an address point has 2 fishbones. That tells me that these addresses exist within 2 ranges. And we want there to be that single relationship between an address point and the appropriate road segment. So I know we talked about the data readiness check earlier on, and this is exactly the type of situation for why NG9-1-1 specific validations can be so helpful for data quality, because this situation might not have been identified just by looking at it, right? The anomalies are really great to draw your attention to areas within the data that need further looking into. So in this specific example, you would need to update the range values to make sure that you're maintaining unique ranges between segments per street, right? I don't know, Annie, if you had anything to add to this situation, but it really is just understanding the relationship of the big picture of roads against address points, and then we'll discuss boundaries a little later on.
Yeah, and the fishbones, again, are very illuminating for your data for a number of different reasons, but you can think of it as kind of like a visual geocode for your data. Go ahead and type in the chat. Are you guys familiar with fishbones? Is this a term that you've heard before, or is this something that you've seen in your own data? Is it something you're curious about, or I don't know, what do you know about fishbones? I could ask you a million different questions. I'm just going to cover them all in 2 seconds.
We've seen a lot
New
of
to
nose
this?
weaknesses. We'll intermix.
Yeah, so basically what fishbones do is it's basically a line that's drawn between the geocoded address point and where it falls along the road center line. Okay, and yeah, Tammy, it is very illuminating because it can give you a clear picture of how well your address ranges are working within your data. And it always kind of brings up a question, well, do I use a theoretical range like 100 to 199, or do I use an actual range like 100 to 139? So it is very, very illuminating for a number of different reasons, but it is a visual geocode at the very simplest. It helps you to identify, are you kind of on the mark with your ranges? Are you off? Are you missing some attributes? You know, do you have address points that are out of order? It's a very fast way to identify some of those anomalies. Okay, so as we mentioned before, that geometry is very important, okay? Because we're dealing with GIS, we're dealing with the information, but we're also dealing with the geography and the geometry of our data layers, okay? And we do have to consider both when we're talking about NG9-1 call routing, okay? Because the attributes are supporting the geometry of the features. All right, so again, it goes back to that kind of holistic data maintenance and understanding that there are relationships between features, especially when we start talking about call routing. So regarding address points, there are some things that we see as part of our data remediation, or when I'm speaking with clients, because one of the things that I do is I do a lot of strategic planning and boundary facilitation workshops, but we do get into this discussion about how do we maintain data. Now, I will tell you that there's not one golden standard for how to maintain your address points, okay? It really depends on the use. And I think I did a webinar a few months ago talking about addressing that might be out on the YouTube channel, but it does talk about kind of like good, better, best practices for maintaining. There is a whole NENA informational document. It's not a standard, it's an informational document out there about how to place your address points for different types of structures. And I would say that, you know, it's written loosely for a reason. It's because NENA identified that, yeah, there are lots of different ways for doing something, and having something is better than having nothing, okay? So that's why you see these different placement methods. What gets us is the inconsistency, right? So sometimes we'll see them in a parcel centroid, which is very common if you have pre-addresses on your lots. And I have a lot to say about that. This is not the appropriate webinar, okay? Don't do it. Just don't pre-address and release those by. But no, the entrance to a property along the property boundary is kind of less common. Road center line, a lot of times we see that for different CAD purposes. Obviously, on top of the structure is preferred for NG9-1-1, but maybe not for AVL. So, you know, you have to kind of have the other conversation. Well, if I'm in a rural area, now these really long driveways, how do I manage that? And my answer would be go ahead and develop a layer for your driveways, or develop a layer that shows the access points to those properties, because you could have a big rural farm property with 3 or 4 different entrances, depending on how the property is geographically. So there are lots of different ways to place address points. Our advice would be just be consistent, right? And then of course the sub-address management. Sub-addressing fields are optional in the data model. But I will tell you, from a public safety perspective, it's always better to pack the record, okay, and give your first responders as much information as you possibly can. The screenshot on the right is actually from the informational document. Again, it's not wrong, but it's not the best. Okay, it's not really going to be valuable for someone referencing this data in the field. So you have to think like a first responder. You show up, someone's having a heart attack. What data do you need? What's going to be the most valuable placement method for what you're trying to accomplish. And I would say the more accurate you can be, the better. But again, the informational document was written loosely with the understanding that, you know, at a bare minimum, we want people to have address points, with the ultimate goal to be as accurate as possible, you know, 1 point per structure, you know, with an access points layer maintained and all of these different things, all these different requirements that we can put additionally, right? So, you know, don't get hung up on this, but be consistent, okay? As consistent as you can. By the way, sub-addressing is a really good project for like an intern. If you want to kind of pursue a GIS internship, it's a really good project for people looking to flesh out that data in their GIS. Okay, you can have somebody drive around, visit these apartment buildings, make phone calls. This is a very common thing that people do to get that information.
All right. So let's talk about road centerline geometry now. I have here a few examples of what you want to be mindful of as you are fixing up your data or maintaining your data. So topology is so important within GIS data, and it literally means that the spatial relationship between features. So remembering that this data is replacing the MSAG and alley, so the data needs to perform the same functions. If roads aren't split or snapped at intersections or boundaries, you won't be able to get accurate vehicle routing, right? It won't be recognized as an intersection, and the attribution of the features will be inconsistent. In these cases, I always like to say data should be an accurate representation of the real world situation. So if we're thinking of a highway overpass, for example, that segment can be left unsplit where the road intersects, right? Because in the real world, if you think about it, a highway overpass, they don't physically intersect. So if the road were to be split at that overpass, the data model does have attribute fields that can be maintained to provide context around that situation, like the elevation field, for example. But remember that this data is solving problems for us, right? So we want to make sure we're consistently maintaining it from an attribute and geometry standpoint. So here, got some examples. This left picture here, it shows inconsistent snapping at intersections. Not having center lines properly snapped at intersections can cause misroutes to emergency locations and could potentially add time to that, critical response calls. So a center line segment that's overshooting, which is seen at the top right here, the intersection, or undershooting, as seen in the bottom left, we'd want those segments consistently snapped to the intersection. So there might be some cases where an undershoot is accurate, right? Like if this is a cul-de-sac, or if the street is truly a dead end where it's inaccessible to somebody out there routing, it shouldn't show that intersection. But we'd want to have that be an exception in our data, right? So remember that this data shows what's happening in the real world. And when a true intersection is there, like in that bottom right corner, that's what your data should look like. So you need to make sure that all endpoints are snapped appropriately. There's nothing, and that just goes back to topology, right? Us as GIS folks, we hold topology up on a pedestal, which we should, right? It's really important. So all of these situations can really impact response time, and it's essential that geometry issues be found and resolved. All right, so this example here on the right, that shows a center line that needs to be split at a boundary. Beautiful image, right? But think about how this might impact attributes of the roads and address points. So when a road crosses a boundary, there would need to be a change of attribution. So if these are incorporated city boundaries, let's say, and as it is right now, those three address points on the right, they wouldn't properly find that relationship in the center line if that center line was fully attributed to represent the city on the left. So it would need to be broken, and then the attributes would need to be updated within that segment to reflect the boundary that it falls within, and then also the address points that are associated with it. So attributes of center lines and address points are used for location validation, and the boundaries are used for call routing. So we want to make sure that all the data within our boundaries have that consistent attribution. You know, remember that we have to think of these layers all together as a single data set serving the purpose for NG9-1-1, right? I have one more example on the next slide. Talk about the digitized directions. And can you go to the next slide for me?
Sorry, I'm trying to field questions coming in from different ways.
It's okay. I guess I could have stalled better. So this situation here, I first want to say that I have the data symbolized here to tell the story, but if you don't have the symbology on your lines to show the endpoint, for example, then you might never notice this issue in your data. And that's, again, why having some of these validations highlight anomalies in your data is really important. So in this situation, what we see here is that the endpoint of the segment is pointing to the south, and the address points on the left and right sides of the segment are increasing. So they're increasing in the opposite direction that the line is currently pointing. And we also see that the left and right ranges aren't representing the proper sides. So I guess, yeah, the address points are even currently on the left side of the segment, but the left range is odd. So right there, there's not a proper relationship happening, right? So all of these issues are being caused from the center line being incorrectly digitized. And what we would do is we want to flip that segment and just make sure that the road is digitized in the direction of increasing address values and that the ranges are reflecting the addresses appropriately. So again, to the naked eye, we might not have been able to identify this, but it really is something that, like Annie mentioned, the best practice is just consistent maintenance of your data. So again, we have to remember that this data has to be correlated. So you have to think of everything as a big picture. And since this one road wasn't accurate, it was causing the address points to have issues, right? They're appearing disordered, they're appearing on the wrong side of the road. And this is definitely something that, you know, to be mindful of as you add and edit data, right? So it's kind of that preventative mindset of, hey, if I am updating a range, am I going to create a discrepancy in my data set? So just kind of like thinking ahead and understanding the impact of data sets, the roads, address points, the boundaries, how they all play in, together. Right? I don't know, Annie, again, if you wanted to add any context to this, but otherwise we can move on.
Yeah, this slide gives me anxiety, so I'm going to move on.
Yeah. Me too.
Okay, boundary issues. So let's talk about boundaries for a sec, because boundaries are really kind of like the star of the show for NG9-1-1, okay? Before a call ever comes into the PSAP, your GIS data is engaged. That's why when I told you guys earlier that you were geospatial first responders, this is why, okay? Because your GIS data is being used to actually route the call to the correct PSAP before someone ever answers the phone. So for that reason, it's really important to examine your boundaries, okay? And some of the things that we're looking at, obviously we're looking for gaps or overlaps, and an obvious screenshot is here. This is something that we see all the time where address points are really not encompassed by either PSAP, okay? So it's very important to have these discussions with your neighbors. This is something that I do all the time. I'm working a lot. Actually, I've worked all over with Maryland and Florida clients and other folks to really facilitate these discussions and talk about this. So I will put out a cautionary note to GIS people. Don't start going and willy-nilly moving your boundaries around, okay? There's a couple of things. Number one, boundaries are for call routing, okay? These are not tied to legislative boundaries. So when we start getting nervy about, oh my gosh, I can't move my county boundary, no one's asking you to do that. No one's asking you to do that. These are call routing boundaries, okay? So you can move them and you can adjust them. You need to memorialize and understand your decisions, why you're making them, and then document them somewhere, okay? The other thing is that boundaries pertaining to call routing are PSAP decisions, okay? These are PSAP decisions. I'm going to ask another question. Have you guys started developing your boundaries for NG9-1-1? Have you started? And then remember, these are your PSAP boundary, your discrepancy boundary, which is not really it's not our provisioning boundary, I should say. It's not really a call routing boundary, but it is part of that cluster. And then your service boundaries for fire, police, and EMS. And these are different than ESZs or ESBs, but you can use those ESZ or ESBs, what we would call like your legacy boundaries, to help develop those others. I'm gonna pull up the chat here and look.
Looks like
Y'all
we're getting
dropping
down to
stuff?
yes.
Okay. Yes. Okay, good. So it's good to start having these conversations. You know, it is kind of a learning curve because we're it's really a paradigm shift, right? That's what NG9-1 is, because we're taking the I wouldn't say the power. We're removing the reliance on the MSAG and ALI, and we're putting that onto the GIS data, okay? Which means that your data, it needs to be accurate, and we want to examine this. We want to make sure that we're making the best decisions for our boundary locations and having these discussions with our neighbors. This is the time to kind of get rid of like handshake agreements and like I said, memorialize these somewhere where we can have a solid understanding and documented decision about why we're putting a boundary in a particular location and what the response is supposed to look like there, okay? And Becca, did you have anything you wanted to add about boundaries or anything?
No, you're the boundary master. I think you got it all.
Oh, that's a scary station. Okay. Move on past that. All right, so now let's talk about the path forward, okay? One of the things when you're preparing GIS data for NG9-1-1 is really risk mitigation and being proactive and not reactive with your data, okay? Every single record within every feature is going to have tied to it an NGUID, which is a globally unique ID, which is used for error reporting, okay? And that's going to be that. If you ever look at the data model and you see that really weird long ID that has the domain associated with it, okay, that domain ties back to your locality. And once you provision your data into the SI, it's going to go through spatial interface. I should further define that, sorry. Once you provision that data into the SI, it's going to go through its own checks and balances on that GIS data. And what will happen is it will generate a discrepancy report on that data. And it's going to identify via that NGUID what segment of road center line. You know, your main street in your community could have 25 segments, but you might have an incorrectly digitized segment on one of those. So it's going to give you back that particular NGUID and tell you what the problem is, and you're going to have to fix that. Okay, so it's really about getting ahead of that and validating your data and being proactive with those iterative validations before you go through that effort. Because once that comes out of the SI, that error report, you have to resolve that stuff within 3 business days. Okay, and there is still conversation about what that means, and our understanding of that 3 business days is still evolving. So we'll probably have more information on that in the future as those discussions continue. But the point is let's not let it get to that point, right? It's not a bad thing if that happens. It's just, you know, now there's more pressure, right? You don't have as much time to research these different anomalies. Like if you have a whole subdivision that's messed up, or somebody digitized it in and they didn't know what they were doing, you know, let's get ahead of this, okay? So that involves implementing best practices for your addressing and road center line workflows, managing your data in a way that you can create a quality assurance culture. These are very, very important things. Whoops. Got a new mouse. It's a little clicky. Maybe it's just me. So let's talk about best practices for NG9-1 data maintenance and management, okay? Again, like we talked about earlier, you want to understand your requirements, understand what's required for your standard. Whether you're following a state standard or a national standard, you need to understand what fields are required in addition to all of the layers that you need. As Becca reviewed earlier, you want to go ahead and parse those address elements out. That also goes back to call routing and tying that to civic locations. There's a whole nerdy process that goes on there, but this is not the time or the place to talk about that. But that's why you have to parse those out, right? Standardize your attributes, okay, and make sure that you are maintaining those legacy fields within the data model. That's very important. Because most of you are maintaining legacy data, right? You're using abbreviated values. So go ahead and populate those legacy fields because those are conditional. And what conditional means is that if you have the data, it needs to be populated. Okay, so go ahead and populate those legacy fields in the data model because that's only going to help you going forward and allow you to continue supporting your existing business needs that are consuming the data in those particular formats. Be mindful about how other features impact the attributes. So yeah, when you go to add in an address point or when you're going in and splitting, make sure that you're being mindful of your road, I almost said road ranges. Split your road center lines at boundaries and update those attributes, okay? Because you want all of the attributes in your road center lines and address points to reflect the boundary information, okay? And then be mindful about your digitized road direction. So create a quality assurance culture. That involves creating a situation where you're engaging everyone who's involved in these different workflows, okay? The data that's NG9-1-1 ready, it's not just about the data. It's about everything that goes into getting the data where it needs to be. Everybody who touches that data, who supports the workflows that support that data. Okay, so one of the big things that I talk about in my strategic planning workshops, you know, are your addressing workflows, your public safety workflows, how the data moves through the enterprise. What does that look like? Okay. So understand those existing workflows because you can identify gaps that way and also address ways to improve those, okay? Sometimes people need education about NG9-1-1. You probably already know who those people are in your organization. Drop me something in the chat if you know what I'm talking about and you can read between the lines. Maybe some people are maintaining data or they're participating in workflows and they don't really have a great understanding excuse me, of how this information is going to impact NG9-1-1 or they're resistant to change. We've seen that a lot, okay? And it's because of education. That's all, you know, something that may have worked for someone for 20 years might not work for NG9-1-1. And so it's really important to get everybody together and explain the business need and also communicate the end goal and why we're all working toward this. We want to make sure that we are validating our NG9-1 data regularly, okay? This is not a one and done. So if you work with the vendor to get your data back, please make a plan for how you're going to maintain this going forward. That's so important. It's not like, oh, I got my clean data, I'm good, bye. No, you need to make sure that you have a process in place for how you're going to keep this data quality up, okay? And are there any other questions or any other comments that you guys wanted to add, Dustin or Becca, about this?
I'll add to that last bullet point because it's something that I think can be stressed a little bit, that every time that you make edits to your data, like Annie said, you might get your data to a state of total cleanliness, which, I mean, us as GIS, it's virtually impossible, but every time that you add in a new address, you add in a new apartment complex, or new roads are digitized, there is a potential that you're creating discrepancies in your data, right? Because remember, NG9-1-1 looks at everything as a big picture, how it works together. So I just want to stress that every time you add and edit something, there's potential for that, which is why that routine maintenance, scheduled maintenance is really important.
I would agree with Becca. Constant validation of your data is crucial when it comes to next gen. If you live in a city like I do with Austin, Texas, it's continually growing with new subdivisions, new roadways. Continual editing of your data is always crucial for next gen. And with that being said, if you would, Becca or Annie, next slide. What we see here, and hopefully most of y'all have seen some form of this is your next gen 911 environment. To sum it up, what we see is how the GIS set in this data environment, right? GIS is your central point for the ESINet, right? Once we have taken the GIS data from point A, which is your basic form, to point B, which is next gen ready, it then enters into the environment where it can be utilized for geospatial call routing, your CAD mapping, or even your automatic vehicle location for first responders. So again, that's why we stress the importance of GIS data readiness, right? And that sums up pretty much our whole presentation. What questions do you all have right here at the end for us? We'll give it a moment or two. Oh man, we're getting, let's see.
There's a ton of questions coming in.
We have one from Thomas saying, when is it expected for NG9-1 to go live across the country?
I don't know. I mean, and that's truly, that is the honest and the factual answer. There is no countrywide national date. I know regionally there are deadlines that are being set. So I guess the thing would be to check with your state, or if you're part of a regional project, to see if there's a deadline for that. I did want to ask one more question. Who is using any type of validations for your data? Are you guys currently validating your data for NG9-1-1, or you don't really have a plan in place for that yet? I'm just curious, because I don't know what solutions you guys have implemented locally. Okay. Okay. Okay, that's good. Yeah, using VEP, that's good. Okay, cool. Thanks, guys. Thank you for entertaining this discussion. Let's go ahead and do our little, Dustin, this is you. I'm going to make you do the plug, and I'm going to put my sunglasses back on.
All right, before we dismiss, I'd like to invite everybody to register and attend our 3rd annual Public Safety GIS Conference. It's called the DataMark Orbit Conference, right? It's going to be March 22nd to the 24th, all virtual. And we're going to be including the link in the event the link for the event in the chat here shortly. One more slide over if you would. And this gives a little more information about the conference. We'd love for you guys to join. It's a good collaboration event. It's a good education event. If you want to learn more about GIS, Next Gen 911, please join us. Again, thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Becca and Annie, for an amazing presentation. I hope everybody has a great rest of Tuesday.